back to Aether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a huge episode. We are going to be discussing the fall of the USSR, the place of NATO in the collapse of that, some issues about Yugoslavia, and in general, just the late 20th century and the late communist era in Eastern Europe and how that is affecting what's going on right now in the world with NATO and, the enemies that they are facing off against and what we consider as the ongoing Third World War. But we are joined by a wonderful guest, and I hope Dmitry here can introduce him to us. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad, and it is an absolute honor and a pleasure to have Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos on, a UK-based historian. Of course, he specializes in Russian Soviet history, as well as, of course, history related to the collapse and the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the USSR. And of course, he's been a contributor, I think, as he himself will confirm, on various other subjects, including international relations, geopolitics, essentially subjects right up our alley, with massive media companies such as Sky News, BBC News, Al Jazeera, RT, Al Mayadeen, etc. So the doctor has been, of course, an active contributor on X and Twitter as well, which we will have links to in the description where you could follow some of his opinions on recent, of course, political and geopolitical events, as well as possible historical opinions. So, Dr. Papadopoulos, thank you for joining us today on this very important subject matter discussion because, again, we really wanted to have an expert on. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about yourself, some of the things about the books that you've recently published or throughout the last few years, and just a bit about just yourself. Who are you sort of as a person and as a subject matter expert?
Well, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to both of you for having invited me on to your show at a time of great censorship in the West, along with so-called hate crime laws, both of which aim to suppress free speech. I am always delighted and I am always grateful when outlets such as yours approach me and ask me to give an interview. So again, thank you ever so much for taking the time to contact me, and thank you ever so much again for having me on. So my name is Marcus Papadopoulos. I was born in Britain. I am of English, German, and Greek Cypriot extraction. A few months after I was born, I was baptized in the Church of England. And then at the age of 6, I was baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church. Whilst I am a Christian, it would be wrong of me to say I am religious, and it would be disrespectful to pious people for me to say I'm religious. And let me elaborate on that. If there was a suitable church adjacent to where I live, a church which is not political, then I would attend on a regular basis. Alas, there are no churches close to where I live which are not infected with politics, which are not infected with the cancerous ideology that is woke. So again, I am a Christian, but I cannot say I am pious, and I regret that. I hope one day my circumstances will change on that matter. As regards to my education, I graduated from London Guildhall University with an undergraduate degree in law and modern history. I then graduated from Royal Holloway, University of London, with a master's degree in modern history. And then also at Royal Holloway, I was awarded a PhD in Russian history. To date, I have written 2 books, the first of which was published in January of 2021, entitled Arise, Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. This book focuses on contemporary Russian foreign policy, though there are chapters, substantial chapters, which detail the dissolution, not collapse, dissolution of the Soviet Union. My second book was published in November of 2023 and is entitled Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, British Assessments of the Red Army, 1934 to 1945. Now, this book is based solely on primary source evidence, solely on archival research, principally British government files. This book argues that British assessments of the prowess of the Soviet armed forces between 1934 and 1945 played an important role in British strategic planning. Furthermore, the book argues that racial prejudice towards the Russian race, russophobia, was embedded in Whitehall, principally amongst British military observers. And as a result of that, I argue and corroborate this with very many British government documents that this resulted in the British government underestimating Soviet military offensive capabilities in the mid and late 1930s. It resulted in a belittling of Red Army achievements during the Great Patriotic War. And also, I argue that the russophobia, that the hatred of Russians felt by British military observers played a very substantial role in the deterioration of the Anglo-Soviet Treaty of May of 1942 and the Grand Alliance after Nazi Germany was defeated in May of 1945. So that is, in short, a biography of myself.
That is incredible. And of course, we hope to perhaps have you on for many more discussions, specifically perhaps even of the subject of russophobia and how it's expanding and ever developing in a way. Like it has changed significantly. And it's a thing that's been around for more than 100 years, 200 years. There's been russophobic statements made in the 1700s. And I believe perhaps historically it even began during the times of the Ivans, Ivan III, Ivan IV, maybe since the time of the fall of Constantinople. If you look at propaganda in Eastern Europe, very curious sort of development, but it's always been very similar and unfortunately expanded to this day in a lot of Central, Eastern European and, of course, Western countries predominantly so.
Well, sorry to interrupt you. I should have said, actually, that Whitehall in Stalin's Russia actually traces russophobia in England, then Britain, starting in the 1500s.
Yep.
So there is a substantial amount on russophobia from the 1500s right up until 1934, which marks the period which is under consideration in the book. But what is particularly interesting is that russophobia has, fundamentally speaking, not changed over hundreds of years. If one reads Hansard, which is the official record of discussions in the British Houses of Parliament, let's say 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and compare it to discussions in the House of Commons or the House of Lords today, or in the last, let's say, 10 years, it is remarkably similar. So I, for one, am not surprised in the least by what we are seeing today in both Britain and in America. And I should say as well that after I began giving interviews to RT, which started in November of 2011, I was the first person to introduce the word russophobia on RT. Most people, well, I think the overwhelming majority of people were not aware of that term. And then when I gave an interview to BBC News in October of 2016, an interview which went viral in the world, the first question put to me by the BBC News presenter focused on russophobia.
Well, there we go. No, absolutely fascinating, Doctor. And especially given that November 2011 was the first time when I really dived deep into the world of international relations, modern geopolitical history, and in particular began doing my own personal research outside of, say, schooling and academia of, a certain given curriculum, especially because, of course, October 2011 is when Gaddafi's Libya fell to the military intervention and the revolution which was prompted there. So the timing is uncanny. And of course, as many can say, that's when the situation in the modern world really began to, of course, slope downwards. Well, I suppose the introductory query to our big historical summary here of the dissolution of the USSR would be, when in your eyes, Doctor, would have been the commencement of the dissolution of the Soviet Union? Because in my personal eyes, you can almost see the ideological breakdown of the USSR almost commenced, perhaps this is a very early opinion, maybe in 1982 with the deaths of Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev, the general secretary, as well as, coincidentally, the death of Mikhail Suslov, who was essentially like the gray cardinal ideologically of the USSR. Many people don't know about him, but Suslov is a very interesting figure. He was always the left or the right-hand man of the general secretaries, standing behind the scenes, somehow surviving the Stalinist purges as well, and being recruited into the front lines of the Second World War. Very dark, mysterious, but also very patriotic in his own Marxist way figure. But other people, of course, openly state that the falling apart of the USSR, its dissolution, commenced with the coming to power of Mikhail Gorbachev, a young man in his 50s. By those standards, they call it the gerontocratia, because so many old people were ruling the USSR for literally decades at that time. In March of 1985, and of course the Chernobyl disaster, the pulling out of Afghanistan in 1986, and some people even just blame the perestroika reforms, which Gorbachev then enacted over his late 1980s period of secretariat. So in your particular opinion, Doctor, when should someone, or when would the dissolution of the USSR, when did it kick into gear? Over your analysis of history, especially this particular period, when do you think we should kind of take the commencing hour from an event?
This is a very intriguing question. I personally would cite the year of 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and thereby leader of the USSR. The first thing to say is this: the dissolution of the Soviet Union was not inevitable. The dissolution of the Soviet Union could have been avoided. Firstly, there were only two parts of the Soviet Union which never wanted to be a part of the Union. And those were the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the westernmost part of Ukraine, historically known as Eastern Galicia. So the oblasts, the regions of Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, Volyn, and Rivne. Again, only two parts of the Soviet Union never wanted to be a part of the Union. Secondly, yes, by the time Gorbachev came to power, there were serious problems in the Soviet Union, principally economic problems, in that the Soviet economy had stagnated. The Soviet economy was suffering very seriously from a lack of efficiency, a lack of efficient productivity. However, as I said, that did not mean the Soviet Union's dissolution was inevitable. Many countries, for example, in the Western world, encounter grave economic problems, including America and Britain. But the difference is that in America and in Britain, there were politicians of a very high caliber. And I am talking many years ago. The politicians in the two aforementioned countries today are of an appalling standard. But many years ago, there were exceptional politicians in both Britain and America. In the Soviet Union, that was not the case by the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. As you mentioned earlier, the members of the Politburo, the members of the Central Committee, which essentially was the leadership of the Soviet Union, were very, very old. Young blood had not been coming through. So that is essentially why Gorbachev came to power, because he stood out from the rest. Here you had a young man, relatively young man in his 50s, offering hope, offering a new approach to remedying the problems, the economic problems in the Soviet Union. If I go back a few years to November of 1982, when Leonid Brezhnev died and was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who had been the chairman of the KGB for many years, I have long believed that if Andropov had been in better health, because it was only just a few months after he came to power, he fell seriously ill. But if he had not become ill, if he had been in better health, I believe that Andropov could have reformed the Soviet Union in an economic sense, whilst preserving Soviet power. Andropov was a fascinating man. He truly was a Puritan. He led a puritanical existence. He was a teetotaler. He literally could not understand why men cheat on their wives. He literally could not understand why people were susceptible to bribes. And I'm talking about at home, at a high level in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Andropov was a disciplinarian. He understood that reform was necessary, changes were necessary, but that this must not be at the expense of Soviet power, at the expense of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But anyway, he was not in good health. He died. He was succeeded in early 1984 by Konstantin Chernenko. Again, Chernenko was in very poor health, and he simply did not have leadership skills, in short, especially leadership skills to lead, suitable to lead the Soviet Union, a superpower, which had the largest armed forces and the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So Gorbachev comes to power in early 1985. Gorbachev, like Chernenko, was not suitable to be leader. First of all, his command of the Russian language was woeful. Why? Because his schooling was interrupted by the German campaign to take Stalingrad. Gorbachev was from Stavropol, and the Germans occupied that part of the Soviet Union in the late summer of 1942, as I said, during their drive on Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. So his schooling was seriously disrupted, and his command of the Russian language never recovered from that. So Gorbachev introduced two policies: perestroika, economic reconstruction, and glasnost, political openness. Well, straight away, the first word, perestroika, it was not the appropriate word to use, because Gorbachev argued the economic system isn't working. Well, if a system isn't working, why would you reconstruct it? He should have used a different word, a word which meant construction, construct something new. Secondly, the fatal mistake which Gorbachev made was introducing perestroika and glasnost simultaneously. Because what it meant was this. He openly said, our economic system is not working. And at the same time, he said to the Soviet public, in the context of glasnost, you can say whatever you want about our system. Now, that was a lethal cocktail, and that seriously undermined the existence of the Soviet Union. What he should have done was remedied the economic problems plaguing the Soviet Union. And once that is achieved, then he should have introduced glasnost. But you don't do that at the same time, because then people start questioning the whole basis of the existence of the ruling party, the Communist Party. Furthermore, Gorbachev lacked ruthlessness. He lacked iron leadership. Now, to a lot of people in the Western world, that sounds commendable, but it's not. Especially when we're talking about a country such as Russia or Soviet Union as it was then. A country as vast as the Soviet Union, as diverse as the Soviet Union, requires a very strong leader. Again, that might not be to the taste of people in the Western world, but any Russian will tell you that is how Russia needs to be governed. When you have a weak leader, anarchy breaks out, society collapses. Russia is not the West, and there is no reason whatsoever why Russia should be like the Western world. Moving on, to his credit, Gorbachev did not want to see the Soviet Union dissolved. He wanted the Soviet Union to survive. He wanted a new Soviet Union to emerge. The real villain in all of this, in terms of who killed the Soviet Union, was Boris Yeltsin. But then it goes back to Gorbachev. Gorbachev should never have allowed Yeltsin to remain in Moscow. The two men fell out in the late 1980s. They seriously fell out. Yeltsin developed vengeance towards Gorbachev and pledged to exact revenge on both Gorbachev and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev, again, because he lacked ruthlessness, because he was not a proper leader, instead of banishing Yeltsin, let's say, to Vladivostok, keep him out of the spotlight of the Soviet people, he allowed him to remain in Moscow. Yeltsin was openly threatening the existence of the Soviet Union. He was openly undermining the Soviet Union, and still Gorbachev kept him there. Still, Gorbachev did not take action against him. Then, in March of 1991, Gorbachev holds a national referendum in the USSR, in which the Soviet people are asked, do you wish to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? Now, the Baltic states, Moldova, Georgia and Armenia boycotted the referendum. All of the other republics, Russia, Belarus, the Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Central Asia, the 5 Central Asian republics, voted overwhelmingly to preserve the Soviet Union. In Russia, it was over 70%. In the Ukraine, it was over 70%. In Belarus, it was well in excess of 70%. In Central Asia, such as Kazakhstan, it was more than 90%. So that categorically refutes the arguments put out by Western politicians and Western mainstream journalists and so-called experts in the West that the Soviet Union was a prison of peoples. Now, in December of 1991, referendums were held in the Soviet republics about preserving the Soviet Union. However, that referendum must be seen in the context of the failure of the KGB coup against Gorbachev in August of 1991. As a result of that failure, there was complete chaos throughout the Soviet Union. There was complete confusion throughout the Soviet Union. The Soviet people simply did not understand what was happening. By December, the Soviet Union was all but dead because the leaders of republics, such as in Ukraine and in Belarus, by December of 1991, they had gone from communist to nationalist leaders overnight. And they saw an opportunity to create fiefdoms for themselves, to have their own independent countries. Now, in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in December of 1991, the population was asked about preserving the Soviet Union, but the wording was deliberately ambiguous in that most people in the Ukrainian SSR believed they were being asked, do you wish to have autonomy from Moscow? Not independence, autonomy. That also refutes the argument that the Soviet people did not wish to be a part of the Soviet Union. And who was the ultimate villain of that? Yeltsin. Alongside Leonid Kravchuk, the leader of the Ukrainian SSR, and Stanislav Shushkevich, the leader of the Belarusian SSR. Those three men ignored the will of the Soviet people, which had been expressed at the March 1991 referendum. But again, it comes back to Gorbachev. Gorbachev should have acted upon the mandate which he received at the March 1991 referendum. Those leaders, such as Yeltsin, should have been arrested. Martial law should have been introduced throughout the country. The Soviet people voted. 76% of the Soviet population voted to preserve the USSR. And therefore, if there are politicians which are still trying to bring down the country, then they should have been arrested. But Gorbachev, being the useless, inept leader that he was, did not take any action against the likes of Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shushkevich. So in December of 1991, the Soviet Union is dissolved. As I said earlier on in this discussion, the Soviet Union did not collapse, and it is very inaccurate and quite frankly frustrating for me when I hear even Russian politicians say the Soviet Union collapsed. It did not collapse. The Russian Empire collapsed, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Habsburg Empire collapsed, but the Soviet Union was dissolved, and dissolved by three politicians, three treacherous politicians. Dissolved and collapsed are completely different words. They have completely different meanings. So people must be aware and people must use the right terminology. The Soviet Union was dissolved. The Soviet Union did not collapse.
Thank you so much for listening to this free preview of this episode of Aether Hour with Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Be sure to get behind that paywall to hear the rest of our discussion with him, a very academic level discussion, very unique perspective. So we thank him for coming on. We cover the reunification of Germany, the collapse of Yugoslavia, the wars there in the 90s, as well as the situation in Cyprus with NATO and the general future of NATO, and even some perspectives on Russia and Turkey and other conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea that relate to the former Soviet Union, NATO, and these other topics that we discuss in the first hour. So thank you so much for listening again, and we will see you on the other side. God bless.